Hi, I'm Dr. George Yancey. Let's share some paradigms. And the paradigm I want to share today concerns identity politics, the oppressor, and the oppressed. A key component of identity politics is this notion of the oppressor and the oppressed. This is true whether you're talking about identity politics from conservatives or from progressives. There's this notion that there's a group that's oppressed and there are oppressors. And the focus of identity politics is to relieve the oppressed from the punishment from the oppressors. This drives a lot of what they're doing. Okay, so let's break this down. Let's really examine this notion of the oppressor and the oppressed. The basic action is we must overcome the oppressor. Think about the image of an oppressor. Do we care about how the oppressor feels about anything, or whether or not we're doing right by the oppressor? I submit that this notion gives us a license to do whatever we need to do to down the oppressor. And this allows people in identity politics to do anything to win. They're justified in doing things that normally we think of as horrible, as long as there's winning, because we must overcome the shackles of the oppressor. All right, so in some ways, this key tenet leads to a lot of the excesses that I talk about and others have talked about when it comes to identity politics. This sort of notion that we got to do whatever we got to do because we got to stop the oppressor. So as a Christian, how do I look at this? You may have seen my video about human depravity. So one of my key points is that human depravity affects all of us. None of us are immune to human depravity. That obviously includes people who are oppressing, but, and here's the key, that includes people who are oppressed. And sometimes in the image of identity politics, we almost glorify the oppressed. We see them as on top of us, pedestal. And while we have this image of the oppressor as a Satan type of image, if you will, we almost have a Jesus Christ type of image of the oppressed. And that's a problem. Here's the thing. Even people who are oppressed have human depravity. And sometimes when you flip the script, those who are oppressed will do the exact same thing that they accuse the oppressor of doing. All right, so one of the comments on identity politics is we must bring the oppressed to the table. The people being oppressed have not had their say. They've not had a chance to speak for themselves. And the oppressor has done all that he or she can to make sure that they don't have a fair say. And there's truth to this. You want to look at our racial history? You want to look at our history, how we treated women, how we treat the poor? Yeah, there's truth to that. If you look at Christians in academia, they don't get a seat at the table. So bring a seat at the table, yes. But unfortunately, in identity politics, it doesn't stop there, does it? Oftentimes, what they argue for a seat at the table really is to take over the table and to give the reins of power over to the oppressed, with the notion that because they're oppressed, they will reduce justice. They know what it's like to have been oppressed. Surely they're not going to oppress other people. So we should give them the reins of power. This is a serious problem that those in identity politics do not take seriously enough. People engage in identity politics, even if they're correct in their diagnosis. And I think there is correct diagnosis that they sometimes have on the problems in our society. There are those who oppress others. There are people who have felt oppressed and have reasons to feel oppressed. I think that I'm not saying their diagnosis is always wrong. In fact, a lot of times it's right. So even when their diagnosis is correct, their solution is flawed. Because it's not just about giving power to people. It's about power sharing in a way where everyone can feel at home in society, where the interests of everyone is taken care of. And by merely giving power to the oppressed, by just doing that and not focusing in on what they define as the oppressors, because remember, they're Satan. We don't have to care about them. Whatever to them. Whatever happens to them, that's fair. By doing that, you can create new systems of oppression. You know, you look back at some times where there have been groups that have been oppressed. I like the example of Cuba. That Cuba was under a situation where there's a lot of oppression. And then when Castro came in, he was reacting to very real problems, a very real situation. And what did he do? He reproduced the oppression he had overthrown. The problem is not merely giving power to the oppressed. It's setting up systems where everyone has input and everyone can work things through. And when I discuss racial issues, collaborative conversation, it applies here to identity politics. So I think that even when the diagnosis is correct, the solution is flawed. Inviting formerly oppressed people to the table and hearing them out and taking what they desire, their needs, into consideration, that's what we should focus on doing. Not giving them nearly unfettered power. And if you think that I'm exaggerating nearly unfettered power, look at what's happened at the LGBTQ community lately. Why the community that had a lot of cachet, where people were defending, now is under attack, not by Christians, by the way, necessarily, but by many secular interests who say they've gone too far, especially on the trans issues. I think it was the attempt to try to give them everything, including things such as people who are biologically male playing in women's sports. Some of the issues on kids. I think it went too far because there's this attempt to try to give them everything. And the argument that they have been oppressed and thus deserve everything fell apart by the notions of many of us as we saw some of the extreme examples of attempts to placate them. We can look at racial issues. We can look at why the anti-racism movement has fallen apart. We put people before these programs and we tell them how racist they are and they're white supremacists and how they must do what people of color want them to do. And people see this and they say, no, this cannot be right. This is not a solution. None of this, absolutely none of this, is to say that we should ignore oppression or we should not listen to people. And if you heard that, then you're not listening to this whole video. I'm saying giving unfettered power to any group invites disaster. And that includes people who legitimately can say they've been oppressed. The solution is to find better conversations and to work things through. Identity politics, as long as we overly rely on this oppressor-oppressed ideology, where we satanize the oppressors and we glorify the oppressed, as long as there's a reliance on that by those in identity politics, it will not lead to a just society. It will become a barrier to a just society. And that's why I do not believe identity politics is the pathway to which we're going to fix the problems in our society. We must have better solutions and advocate for ways in which we can bring people together. To that end, I'm happy to announce that I did sign a book contract to write a book on identity politics with Routledge Press. And in that book, I'm going to deal with identity politics on the left and the right, because I don't want this to be a partisan attack. I want to address the way identity politics has played out on the right in the form of conservative Christians, and on the left in the form of anti-racists. Two communities I know very well about. Two communities I know very much about. So I'm happy to announce that. I'll be supplying material on that book as we get closer to publication, if people want to pick it up. So I don't have a lot of details on that right now, but I just want to know that, this is something I've done research in and I want to comment on. And in that book, I want to talk about the problems of identity politics and some alternative ways in which we can approach that. Does this shatter some paradigms for you? Paradigms about thinking about the oppressor and the oppressed and how that can get us in trouble? And are there better ways? I believe there are better ways. And I want us to head towards those better ways. So I hope this is the sort of conversation you'd like to hear about. I hope that you'll consider subscribing to my channel because you'll get more of this type of conversation and more of this content. If you don't agree with me, please leave a comment. Obviously, leave a comment if you do agree with me. Please like this page, like this video if you're so inclined. And thanks for listening to me. And come back. We can shatter some more paradigms.